All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. Happy Friday. It is November 12th of 2021. Thank you for tuning into the stream today, whether you are watching me live here or watching this back as a recording. Always appreciate you being here. We've got a handful of solid questions to walk through today here. Not too many questions in the queue. So as always, if you've got a question for me, pop it into the YouTube chat or pop it into the Office Hours channel on Slack. I try to answer these questions in chronological order in the order that they come in. So get your questions in now. I'll get to it sooner. Some interesting questions here today we'll do a quick little demo of Entry Editor, talk a little bit about research, some questions about the sliders and unique fill in the Entry Editor. So a few different things to talk through today. If you watched that entire Thursday night football game last night, you have my apologies. That was probably the most Thursday night game we've had this season. I think the NFL has been pretty lucky. They've had some really good primetime games so far to this point in the season, but that was probably the least watchable football game I think we've had this year. I watched a little bit of it, but could not get through the whole thing. I suppose if you are just a NFL mega fan, you may have enjoyed watching it, but I couldn't get through the whole thing. Red Zone, I think, has ruined me a little bit for sitting down and watching an entire three and a half hour long single football game, apart from maybe really good primetime games, and of course when we get to the playoffs. But yeah, James said that was disgusting. Yeah, I watched the very beginning of the game and I was like, I don't know if I have this in me, and then I looked down and it was 6-3, and I was thinking, man, I'm glad I'm not watching this. And then I looked down again an hour later and it was 15-3, and I was like, there's no way this could be an entertaining game. And then hopped on Twitter, and it seems like the entire world was agreeing with me there. So, but anyway, what do we have tonight? We've got an 11-game NBA slate. So an improvement over last night's 3-game slate, back to the big slates here. Haven't checked hockey yet today. How big's the hockey slate today? I've been playing a little bit of hockey DFS here ever since our strategy session from last week now, maybe a couple weeks ago. So 5-game hockey slate tonight. So decent little hockey slate here. But looks like it starts at 4 o'clock maybe, or 6 o'clock Eastern. Is that true? I don't know. Doesn't matter either way. But anyway, ever since Mr. Clean and Couch hopped on here with me and taught me the ways of NHL DFS, I've been playing a little bit more hockey DFS. I feel like I know what I'm doing now. So on our YouTube channel, that recording is up. How to beat NHL DFS in 2021. Had some of the experts come on and teach me how to play hockey DFS, teach me why SaberSim is so well primed for building good hockey lineups. So definitely recommend checking that out if you're interested in diving into a little bit of hockey DFS. But anyway, we'll go ahead. Let's start jumping into it, answering some questions here today. I am going to start with a quick demo here. Let me get the app up. And this was from Lundar. And let me grab this question here. About a functionality on the entry editor that I think people maybe overlook. So the original question said, is there a way to upload, and he said on any site, but to upload all of your DK lineups into it and get your ownership percentages? And I assume that, I think that actually specifically means exposure percentages, right? Obviously, if you use SaberSim to crank out 200 lineups in a build, you just know the exact percentages in SaberSim. But Lundar says, I like to hand build some, use more than one builder, etc. Once I've loaded all my lineups in, it'd be great to see overall exposure or ownership, right? Just not sure how to. Thanks. Yeah, so I think this is something, this will be a short demo, but the entry editor does this, and I think it's a functionality that we don't talk about often enough. So you can see this is for, I know he asked us in the NFL channel that do the NBA slate tonight, right? But I've got 50 or so lineups for tonight. And I've got some placeholders in here, but you can imagine, maybe I hand built a few of these, or maybe I did a few on SaberSim, and maybe I built a few elsewhere or whatever. And they're all entered. And I have some idea of what my exposures were when I did individual builds on SaberSim, but I want to know how exposed I am to these guys overall. Especially if you're using hand building as a part of your process, if you're doing some amount of hand building when you're building your lineups, I think it can be a little hard to keep track of your exposure. If you feel like you like a guy for a upcoming slate and you're building slate lineups, it can be pretty easy to get kind of out of control with your exposure to that player pretty quickly. He just ends up being a easy name to click on over and over again. So you just want to make sure you're not totally overexposed. So you can do that. So first thing you want to do is you just go to the entry editor, right? And click download template file from DraftKings. So what this is going to do is for the given slate, could be NFL, could be NBA, it's going to go to DraftKings and it's going to download your entry file for the slate. So you'll see up here, it starts downloading, and you can literally, once it's downloaded, just go ahead and take it in here, drop it in, and pull it up. And it's going to pull in all of the entries, right? So these are all the different contests I have entered for tonight. And it is going to show me the combined exposure I have to any one player. This is across all of the entries, right? So maybe I was building and I didn't realize that I had 98% Tony Bradley, right? 3K guy. That's the Vucevic value, right? Yeah. Vooch is in COVID protocols. So that's the Vooch value. But maybe I didn't realize I'd clicked his name into 98% of my lineups, right? And that's just a little bit too much for me. So I can adjust then from there or maybe rebuild some lineups or whatever. I think it's going to be super helpful. So especially, for most of us, for me, I don't ever even use this because 90% of the time I'm actually just building 47 lineups in SaberSim and just loading them in, right? But even if you're building a 20 max build and a 3 max build and a single entry build, whatever you're doing, or hand building a few, right? This can be really useful at the end to just see where all of your exposures have added up and where they have all ended up. So if you make some adjustments outside of SaberSim, right? So maybe you go back into DraftKings and you're actually like, I don't know, maybe you're on your phone or doing it on the app or whatever. You're editing lineups and you want to see now how things have changed and you want to get a fresh file in there. If you just click upload new entries, and then you'll get this same link. This will download the newest file from DraftKings, and then you can just click select file and then go find it wherever it downloaded on your computer and re-upload. So kind of a pretty useful little tool there. These combined exposures showing how exposed you are to any one player in your lineups. This works for stacks and stuff too. So you can see for football, especially team stacks, game stacks, stack types. You can see all this. Again, we're doing basketball here, but very useful. So Lundar, if you're watching, give me a wave. Let me know if that was helpful. If you have any follow-up questions, hopefully that answered your question well. But yeah, definitely a pretty cool little tool with the entry editor there. So KJ said, took 2nd and 5th in the pooch punt contest for NFL last night. Just wanted to say thanks for all the content. Has helped a ton getting used to SaberSim. Congratulations. That's great. The pooch punt is enormous. This is a massive contest. 2nd and 5th, when you think about that from the standpoint of what your finishing position is, like from a percentage standpoint, is outstanding. That is an amazing result. So I'm glad to see you're having success. SaberSim is really, really well equipped to knock these single game contests out of the park. So, but since I saw this question, I'll answer it real quick. KJ said, been dabbling in hockey, but the contest selection is so far off from the bankroll building fundamentals. Trying to decide between $20 and the $1 hip check or 40 and the 50-cent mini max. Yeah, I think that hip check grades out a little bit better from our contest selection principles. A lot of the multi-entry stuff just doesn't really grade out that well at all. I think these two contests are probably going to be, let's see. So like 40 entries in this versus 20 in the hip check. I think the hip check's probably a little bit better because it's a 20 max rather than a 150 max, right? Quarter jukebox is probably, like, you could play 40 lineups combined in the quarter jukebox and the hip check and probably do a little bit better than playing those 40 in the mini max. That's probably what I would do. I've been sticking to the single entry stuff because I think those are the best contests. That's what Mr. Clean and Couch said they like to do too, generally. So a lot of what I've been playing is, let's see. Daily Dollar's totally fine, but I like the one-timer and the knuckle puck quite a bit. Only 3 lineups, but I think the contest quality is a lot better there, and I've kind of preferred to be playing those in general. So, but I think probably the hip check would be the better option if you wanted to dive into some multi-entry or the quarter juke. So that's what I would do. If you're just chasing the top, right? I mean, this is a terrible contest, but that's the sweat contest, I guess. But yeah, so I like those single entries. That's what I would recommend if you're dipping your toes into the water. That's kind of what I've been playing, and you're just gonna have a lot of people that don't know what they're doing, which is nice. Like especially with hockey too. There's not a lot of the one thing to always remember with these contests too is on the sports that are a little bit more niche and there's not as many people playing them. Yes, the contests are going to grade out worse, But there's also so much less good content out there, so much less quality videos and articles and things like that coming out about the sport that the people just end up playing way worse in those contests as well, right? Like people are just going to do dumb stuff in hockey. Like I think there's not even a very clear pattern of people like consistently stacking enough from what I've seen in those contests. You get also weird stuff with people doing negative correlation with their skaters and their goalies and things like that. So it's true of all sports, right? Pretty much anybody walking into their very first NFL DFS contest nowadays may go look online and, you know, Google NFL DFS tips or something like that, and probably end up walking into an article that tells them, hey, use a quarterback and a wide receiver together, and here's some actually pretty good plays, right? Pretty easy to wander into that kind of stuff. That gets you at a baseline, building a decent lineup. That stuff's harder to find for hockey and any of the smaller sports. So esports too, like the basics of lineup construction are just not there for people out there playing League of Legends and CSGO. But anyway, it's only my second question here, so let's go ahead and I'll try to keep my rambling under control today, and dive back into some of the questions here in our queue in our Office Hours channel. So this one was from Andrew, and he said, "What do you feel is more important: number of contests you place in the top 1%, or number of lineups you put in the top 1%?" Definitely the number of lineups you put into the top 1%. That's probably the bigger question there. I don't know. I don't think knowing what number of contests that you put any lineup into the top 1% would really do, unless you were just playing a ton of single entries. But when I talk about top 1% equity, which I do a lot here on stream, I'm referring to on a per lineup level. So if I play, you know, this is a perfect example tonight, right? I have 47 entries. So my expectation, right? My average expectation isn't even to put a single lineup in the top 1%, right? 1% of 47 is like a half of a lineup. So, you know, if I put one lineup in the top 1% tonight, I outperformed my expectation. In reality, I've mentioned this before, that's not actually how it ends up working, right? It's not. My pattern of success in DFS is not going to be me putting one lineup of my 47 into the top 1% every night and waiting for my bink night. It's going to be like a lot of nights with 0, a lot of nights with 0, a lot of nights with 0, and then one night I'll have 10 in the top 1%, and then one will take the contest down or something like that. But it is indeed the number of lineups you are putting in the top 1% that is the calculation you really want to look at. So Aaron said, "What are you going to buy with your crowns?" Yeah, I've never spent my crowns. At least I don't think so. 98, almost 100,000. I'm hitting that 100,000 here pretty soon. I don't know. DraftKings redid their rewards thing now. I got to go check out the shop. I've been seeing some weird shop items on Twitter that I'm not sure if are real or fake, but the antimicrobial kids protractor for like 250,000 crowns definitely caught my eye. Might have to save up for that. I haven't been able to get into the new DK shop, so every time I get an error. So I'm waiting to see when I can finally get in there. I've been saving them for a long time, thinking eventually that I may either use them to max a Millie Maker or just buy a big single entry like Thunderdome ticket. And I can't decide between those two options which one I'm leaning towards more. The contest selection principles tell me to spread those out in more entries, but it feels a little bit, I don't know. Kind of seems fun to just go all in on like a $5,300 ticket and just play a Thunderdome one time and see what I can get away with. I don't know. We'll see. I think that the like positive EV move is to not do this, right? Like DraftKings is kind of praying people do this, and I've just always just saved them because I like seeing that number go up. But I think in reality, you should use them when you can. Like maybe pick a contest that sizes really well. Right? Like a week. I mean, NFL sizes really well every week, but maybe like a Christmas Day NBA slate or a golf major, whatever your preferred sports are, right? There's those occasions where they have like a really nicely sized contest where your effective entrants are going to be really high. Could be a really positive EV contest. I think that would be the right time to go in on it rather than just racking them up over and over again. But anyway, let's keep it going here. So Joe asked, and I answered a similar question last week. But Joe said, what are the best sites to use for NFL research? Some of the older SaberSim YouTube videos have recommendations, but some of those sites no longer exist. Also, would you recommend a paid subscription to any sites for research? Beyond SaberSim, no. SaberSim's the best. No other paid sites. In terms of other places to go for research, I've mentioned here a bunch before that actually SaberSim ends up being the point where I do a lot of my NFL research, my research for everything anyway, right? Like, I think that's one of the actual valuable tools here is you can use, this isn't just a dumb optimizer or a calculator or a spreadsheet or something like that, right? Because we have the game simulations. We can actually use this as a research tool. I've talked plenty about how I go about doing that with my research builds, right? Running builds at 0, 0, 10 sliders. I don't know why that's down there. And doing 1,500 lineup builds like this, right, at these sliders. It'll give you basically 1,500 different slate simulations. This is like my favorite research tool in the entire world. This is what I do every single week. But beyond that, right, in terms of thinking about research, I would say here's a better way to think about it, right? Because I could give you a name, but like I don't know how useful that is, right? I think here's what I would look at is look for people that are defending their arguments with data. Look for people that are defending their arguments with data that has some kind of sample size associated with it. Avoid people that seem like they're like really intentionally either just bandwagoning or throwing out just hot takes, right? There's going to be a lot of stuff out there that is just clearly written to be a hot take and to be controversial. And there's also a lot of people out there that, you know, hey, who are the best plays this week? Well, yeah, I'm really liking Dearness Johnson, right? Like, yeah, that's thanks. Like, that's good, right? But everybody knows that kind of stuff. I would say those aren't super helpful. There's a lot of free good information out there on Twitter. And that can be one spot where I like to look a little bit and just see like what people are talking about. But again, this question's a little tricky for me to answer because most of what I do here is going to be within the app. And the research that I'm doing outside of the app is more useful, I think, to determine where I think the chalk is going to be than what I'm actually going to play. Personally, that's kind of how I end up using this. So because I like to know, like, if I go watch a video. There are times where I may go watch a video or read an article or read a tweet where somebody's talking about somebody and I'm like, oh, wow, that's actually a really like that's a good take. I don't think a lot of people are going to be on that guy. That's defended with data that's really backed up. And like, wow, that's kind of interesting. But 99% of the time, what more happens is I'm like, okay, the field is on this guy. The field thinks they're going to be on this guy's. And even when it's low owned plays, right? Even when they're talking about low owned plays, I don't think, oh, I'm going to rush to go play those guys. I think, oh, the field is going to think these are the good low owned plays, you know? So, but that's kind of my stance overall on it. I mean, for like a few just quick, I guess just shout outs. I watch a lot of Al Zeidenfeld's videos. I watch most of his videos he puts out every week. Those are super entertaining. And I think he's pretty sharp and also definitely very helpful to kind of get a read on what the field is going to do. I think he boils down the slates in a pretty clear way. That's a good one. I'm trying to think. I like Jordan Cooper, Blenderhead's podcasts quite a bit. I think those are interesting. Those aren't so much NFL research, but I think those are interesting from a theory standpoint of DFS. That's literally what his podcast is called. So I like those. Sal Vetri's good too. Very similar to Al, I think, in terms of like his slate breakdowns. Very helpful. If you are struggling, let me say this too. If you are struggling understanding ownership, and if you are either going onto SaberSim every week to set your NFL lineups and these are surprising you, right? Our projected ownerships, or these are feeling very off, or if you are updating these and finding that you are very off after you have made adjustments, that I would definitely recommend going and watching some of the free content that is out there on YouTube, because I think it will prepare you more to figure out where the chalk is going to be. that is like, I think, one of the most important things that can happen for your NFL DFS process. Like, there are certain situations. Last week, we turned all the cards over, and Marquise Brown was like 35% owned in large field GPPs. I don't think any ownership model really expected that. I think that was a bit of a surprise. But I would say 80% of the players, when the cards get turned over for an NFL DFS slate, should be like, they shouldn't really blow your mind on ownership, I would say, in general. Like, you should have probably expected a lot of what you actually see with actual ownerships, given all the resources that are out there for you to study before the slate, even just down to ownership numbers. But so anyway, leave it there. Don't know. Hopefully that answer was helpful. It's at the very least honest. That again, I'm not spending a lot of time throughout the week researching things to go in and dial in these numbers super precisely. I like dialing in these numbers, and I like seeing what the field's going to do and just think about it from my game theory standpoint. But yeah, so I see the YouTube chat is popping here. So I'm going to go ahead. We'll rip through the other questions that have the other questions that were in my queue before the start of the stream, and then we'll get over to the live questions. So this was a question from GB, and he said, I often find myself turning the ownership fade down from the default, mainly because I feel like my lineup construction is different enough that I don't need it. Am I messing up the SaberScore by doing this, or is it still using the drop downs when competing SaberScore? I've learned to trust SaberScore to get me good lineups, and I don't want to mess with it too much. So changing your sliders will change the way SaberScore is calculated. So if you had an identical lineup, but one was built with a certain set of sliders and another was built with a different set of sliders, they would be graded differently on SaberScore. With that said, though, I wouldn't worry too much about this. I think if you're turning ownership fade down because you are making adjustments to make your lineups, like maybe you're editing exposures or your player pool in step one to make sure that you're already have some leverage on the field, or you're getting off of some of the chalkier plays, I think it's fine. Like, I wouldn't sweat that too much. So, I mean, yes, like say you're turning this down, right? This will change the way the SaberScore is calculated for the lineups at the end, but it won't. I don't think that's negative EV at all. Like, that's probably actually a good thing. You want to judge the quality of the lineups by the same metrics, by the same tools you use to make the lineup, right? You wouldn't want, for example, to ask the builder to build lineups with no ownership fade, with ownership fade off, but then judge the lineups as like with ownership at a very high setting, because then the lineups wouldn't have really been made for that purpose. So I overall, I got no problems with what you're doing here, GB. I think it makes sense. So this question from Guy Will Gamble here. Is there an issue with using the no more than X player logic in the basic stacking rules for NBA? When I toggle that option, the teams and positional options disappear. Yeah, it's not. It's never done that. Well, we've never had the teams and positional options here with the no more rule. This is supposed to be a blanket rule. I actually don't really know like why we don't have the teams and player rules here. But this is really supposed to be like a big blanket if you don't want any players over a certain, or you don't want any lineups with a certain stack size that's over a certain size. If you want to get really dialed into the individual teams that are included in this, I think it's way easier to set. Here's what I would do. First of all, I would set your like blanket max. So maybe your max is 4, just for example. Like, I'm not playing a lineup that has more than 5 players from the same team, right? Or I'm not playing a lineup with 5 players from the same team. So no more than 4 players from the same team, just as like a blanket rule to make sure we're good there. And then build this and use the exposure management in step 3 to dial it in. So you can go in here and individually see if you have any lineups with stack sizes over a certain size. You'll only get those really big lineups. You only really get those really big stack sizes on slates where one team has a ton of value. So like, it could be Chicago tonight, could be Denver, could be Phoenix. But I would go in here so you can then go team stacks and you can look and see. So I have no 5 stacks, right? That's because I set a stacking rule. I have no 4 stacks just by pure chance. 11 game slate kind of makes sense. But then we go in, oh, I have no 3 stacks. Okay, so I don't even have 3 stacks in this particular set. Only 2 stacks. But if we expanded to the pool of 500, right, there are some 3 stacks that are in the pool. There's no 4 stacks in the pool. So, but I would manage it here. So maybe you're like, I don't want, now that I've seen this build run, well, let's expand this a little bit. Not 550. Okay, so no 3 stacks in the top 50. Maybe you just say, I don't want, for whatever reason, I don't want any Boston 2 stacks or something like that. You can manage it here. I think that's a little bit easier. But you won't get too many of these big stacked lineups, except for on slates where it makes sense. Like 3-game slate last night, you probably would get some. And if there was an insane, enormous value on a slate like tonight, you could get some too. But that's the easiest way to do it. So. And then I'll get your other question here real quick. Let's grab this one here. When using the fill contest feature in the entry editor, does it fill randomly by each time you use it? For example, if I want to use a pool of 200 lineups to fill my large field GPPs, and then use that same pool to fill a smaller amount of satties and smaller tourneys, can I use the fill contest feature and fill with unique entries twice, or would I technically need to have 2 separate pools of lineups? If you filled it twice, so if you took the same pool of lineups, but then in the entry editor filled separately 2 different times, you could potentially dupe that in that. So like, let's say I took that build I just ran and like took these ones first, right? Just these 3 and filled it. And then I went back and removed those and filled the others. You could duplicate yourself then. So it's only really unique in the individual fill you're doing. At this point, I could potentially have a duplicate lineup in here. So I would say for this example, if you want a unique lineup in all of your large field GPPs and all of your satellites and smaller tourneys, I would just build all of your lineups together and do one big unique fill. But if you're okay with a little bit of duplication there in between the fills, you can do them separately. But I don't know why you would, right? From my perspective, if you're using the same set of lineups anyway to fill the contest, you might as well just build the exact amount you need and fill uniquely. I think maybe if you had a single build to do your large field GPPs and then a different single build to fill your satellites and smaller tourneys, those would be 2 separate builds and you could fill those separately. But if you take the exact same lineup build and fill it twice uniquely into a different set of contests, you do open yourself up to potentially be duplicated. It will work, but you could potentially be duplicated. So. Let's see. Question from Rod came in Slack here, and he said, any plans to add advanced lineup filters for NBA, such as only include 1 player below 4K salary? We do have some stuff in the works to add a lot more control in step 3 for individual player combinations and filtering and things like that. I don't know if we have talked so much about salary. And I would be curious, like maybe I would be curious how you would use that, or like why you would do that. Like what would be the use case there, I guess. Like this lineup would be eliminated, and maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. But it seems like a good lineup to me. Grades out pretty well, projected score. I would just be curious on like how that would be used. But I mean, our goal is definitely to add a lot more individual lineup control here in step 3. Another thing that we have talked about here before is having the ability to just plug out players and plug in players, see combinations of players. So like you can already see, show me all of my Cade Cunningham lineups that also have Luka, right? But you can't do that much with this at the moment other than just unchecking or checking in lineups that have this combination. So we want to give people more control to be able to say, build me more lineups like this, or remove lineups that look like this, or whatever. But I think I haven't heard the different players with individual salary before. So I'm curious like how that would be used. That sounds, I will say, that definitely sounds like a rule of thumb. And if you've watched my my streams here before, not the biggest fan of the rules of thumb, right? Like I could see on a traditional tool, optimizing purely for average projection, no simulations, no sim variance, no ownership fade, right? Well, then we want to maybe remove combinations of players that we want to remove lineups that have 2 players under 4K salary, because we know that lineup wasn't built for upside, right? It was built for average performance, and in the hunt for upside, we want to remove those combinations of players. But with SaberSim, right, leveraging our simulation data, we know that the individual lineups themselves have upside, so we don't need to worry so much about that. It's the same conversation with player groups, right? Question last week, hey, when are you going to add player groups? Well, we probably will not, because our correlation slider, the problem of player groups is intended to solve the problem of correlation in DFS, and our individual correlation data for each player combined with our correlation slider solves that problem better than player groups do. But with all that said, again, definitely would be interested to hear like how you would use that, because I might not be thinking about it the right way. So, okay, cool. Let's jump back up. Let's get to some of these questions here live. Jared said, if you're building just a single lineup, how many lineups do you recommend you have in your pool? Yeah, good question. I think I'd probably do like 100, right? It's not really going to make a big difference. Once you get under the 500 lineup pool size, you don't really add any additional speed, not really like anything noticeable. So I think even the 500 that shows up here by default is totally fine. But I would say 100 is probably the minimum I would do here. Just have a nice pool that you can actually like pick through. It depends on how much that you're going to actually go through and edit here as well, right? Like if you know you're probably just going to take the first lineup you see, you can go lower than this, but I think 100 is probably plenty. 500 is fine too. It won't take that much more time to build the lineups at this point. The jump from 500 lineups to 1500 lineups is definitely a little bit longer than 100 to 500. So DJ Sirius said, so for NHL, players are highly correlated, but you can't play all the top players based on salary. So in a 20 max lineup, how do you determine what players to use after running the sims? Good question. I will tell you what I've been doing recently. I will say, if you haven't seen it already, check out the How to Beat NHL DFS video that's on our YouTube channel. A little over an hour long. Has Mr. Clean and Couch on here talking it through me with you. Those guys are both sharper DFS NHL players than I am. So I will say a little bit of what I've been doing recently to like think about my exposures and how I've been doing this. Here's what I would look at. So we do our build. I have been this is from that video as well, but I've been setting a stacking rule here to do 3 players from the same even strength line to get lineups where I've been doing this. So 2 stacks of 3 players on the same line, right? Most highly correlated skaters in the most high correlations in NHL DFS are the skaters on the same line. So I want to group those 2 players together, even with the correlation slider set where it's at. I want to make sure that those correlations happen here. And then I've been going in here and running my build. And with how high variance NHL is, my biggest thing that I've been doing, and again, I've been sticking closer to 1 to 3 entries rather than 20, but the main thing that's been in my mind is looking at ownership. Because if we look, we can pull up, we'll see in a second, we can pull up a player's range of outcomes. Even the chalkiest skaters that night, whatever the big chalky stack is, their most common outcomes generally are a lot lower than their mean, maybe even close to 0. So a big consideration of who I want to end up playing ends up being who are some of the lower owned plays. And if I can get lineups and combinations of players that have a similar high SaberScore as other lineups, but have a lot lower total ownership or a lot lower ownership on the primary stack, I'm going to do it. This build is running a little slow. We'll get like maybe a pool of 100 lineups here rather than the full 500. And I'll show you what I kind of think about. Little bit of a slow build here for sure. All right, 100 is fine for the purpose of giving the example here. What we'll do, since I only have 100 lineups, is we'll assume I'm only going to play 5, right? But one thing I like to do right off the bat is I will look and just see who the highest projected owned players are. and see how my exposures are working out, right? So the ownership fade for most hockey slates is going to be pretty high anyway. So I found that I'm often underweight on some of these popular guys, but let's go ahead and change some values here so I can see my lineups. Yeah. So I've been just really aggressive with my handling of ownership, right? Like we look at a guy like Austin Matthews here. You can see he's projected for 17 mean points, right? Because he has this big long ceiling tail, but his most common outcomes are quite a bit lower than that. And if we get 35% ownership on him, I've been taking the stance that I want to be under or completely fade a lot of these guys. And that's how I've been approaching most of these big stacks overall, right? So some of these top players, I've been really aggressive with this here. And it looks like we're not summing ownership too, which is weird. So I'll look into that. But that's kind of been my approach overall. It's similar. I found hockey here has played very similar to baseball. And I talked last baseball season in one of these office hours here about how when you think about these stacks, right, the average projection, the difference between the highest average projected line one, for example, and the highest average projected, the second highest average projected line one on the slate, that difference is biggest at the average and smallest at the ceiling, right? And the ceiling outcomes are what we actually care about. But I may have to go dig it up because there's a really good office hours thing. But what you will see is, like, for example, right, you can almost kind of see it visually here is you see this, we're talking about, let's just look at centers, right? So Austin Matthews is twice as highly projected on the average as the 10th best center on the slate, 9th best center on the slate. But if we look at what happens at the 95th percentile, that difference is now, he's only, this number is 60 probably percent of the 95th percentile outcome, right? Teams have a much closer, teams and stacks have a much closer 95th percentile outcome than they do average projection, which means that ownership that is mostly going to follow the average projections is often inefficient on the highest owned lines and skaters, right? Again, somewhat new to the NHL thing here. I'm really coming from the background of another high variance, high correlation sport that I play a lot of, and that's baseball. But I think the principles are the same here. So my biggest differentiating factor is ownership in how I'm determining where I want to be. And I'm like almost at this point just taking blind stabs of fading ownership pretty aggressively in my hockey lineups. So Rob said, I'm a little behind on the stream, but the problem I found using just the correlation slider without an even strength rule is that, in my opinion, it overvalues one-offs from the power play unit. Yeah, I think that's a strong observation. Yeah. No, I think there's some improvements that can be made a little bit overall too into the way that correlation is handled on the hockey side. Definitely aware of that there. But I think in the meantime that adding those stacking rules definitely adds some value here. So, but keep rolling through some questions here. Ooh, a lot of questions here. Awesome. Okay, cool. So Matt said, when you do 20 maxes, do you tend to go all in on what SaberSim gives you or have a rule of thumb with the leverage column to see if you're too overexposed? Particularly for NBA, but could apply for NFL too. For NBA, I'm less concerned with what my exposures look at lock, right? Because I know the most likely outcome is that I'm going to have to be late swapping anyway, right? So I'm not overly concerned with being super dialed into exposures at lock for NBA because you're going to be late swapping. Almost certainly the slate is likely to change. You get such a massive edge from swapping when the time comes that I'm less concerned about dialing in exposures either to find leverage on the field, right? Or to manage your risk for NBA. Like, put another way, I don't really care about like finding the absolute optimal leverage on the field of a 7 o'clock mountain. I'm in mountain time zone at 9 p.m. Eastern game at 7 p.m. Eastern when I know I'm almost certainly going to be swapping at 7:30 and 8 and 8:30 as well. So, but in terms of what I might do for NFL, higher variance sport as well, I definitely, at the very least, like to try to manage my risk a little bit here. So if I were building, let's just see what we get. First thing I always do is just do a test build and just see what we're getting out of this, right? So default settings, not going to touch a thing here. Let's just see what we're getting. This also is kind of a risk assessment question, right? This is going to be different for every person. Not every person is going to have the same risk tolerance. Some people are going to want to flatten these exposures out a little bit more. Some people are going to want to condense them. But I will show you kind of what I think about here. And it definitely starts with just seeing how the slate looks. So let's see. Okay, cool. So one of the big things that I like to do is I do use this leverage column, as you mentioned here, and I really am looking for situations where maybe one player is really out of line. If there's a player that is significantly, if I have significant higher leverage to one player compared to every other player on the rest of the slate, that is a situation where I will often walk this back. I also like to generally make sure that I am not significantly overexposed to any one player or any set of players compared to what my maximum leverage could be for any player on the slate, right? So this is a unique slate where I actually do think Dearness Johnson could be 40% owned in large field GPPs. But typically for NFL main slates, the highest owned player is around 30% owned, right? And what that means is the maximum negative leverage you could get on any one player is negative 30% leverage, right? What I like to use that as a bit of a guidepost of how much positive leverage I need on any one player. So one thing I will do, and it is slate dependent, it's player dependent as well, but a lot of times what I'll do is I'll knock down, after making some adjustments to ownership projections, I'll knock down my top end leverage to some of the top owned plays that I'm exposed to get them a little bit closer to like what the maximum negative leverage I could see on a slate being. So maybe I bring this down a little bit here. Right. Now, I'm playing typically a lot more than 20 lineups. On a 20 lineup build, your sim variance is going to be a little bit lower. You're going to have a little bit more condensed player exposures. So I'm going to have to do a little bit more here than I actually typically do in my final builds that I run on higher settings. But I do typically do something to this effect to tone down my risk in NFL here, right? So this feels now a little bit better to me. So again, I don't have any player that I'm significantly higher exposed to than any other player on the slate. And I've brought down some of my maximum exposures to some of these guys so that I'm not getting significant more positive leverage than I could possibly get negative leverage to any player on the slate. And again, that's just a guidepost that I use that I think, Matt, you asked a similar question yesterday about player pool curation on step one. And I had a similar answer there where I like to come up with these strategies that allow me to be, to include slate context, right? I want to have a wider player pool when there's less value on the slate for NBA. I want to have a more condensed player pool when there's more value on NBA. Same thing on, same thing in football, right? When ownership is going to be more spread out, I want to be a little bit more careful with my exposures. And when ownership is more condensed, I'm okay having a very high exposure to a certain player to make sure I still have positive leverage on that guy. So that's kind of my approach here. But I think overall it's a good idea, especially in higher variance sports like football, to at least have a thought about how you are approaching your risk for that contest and thinking about kind of what it actually means, what this leverage column actually means, right? You're getting 47% additional exposure to James Conner over the field. So Dean said, in NFL DFS Showdown, is there any certain pattern to the builds that get you to the top 1%? I run with just 3-3 and 4-2 with 4 on the Vegas winner side. Yeah, so I'll say this. I think that's going to lead you to chalky lineups that have a strong chance of being duplicated, because that's what optimizers that are optimizing for pure average projection are going to do a lot. I also think just people have a bias, especially when they're hand building, that leads them away from building lineups that are like 5-1s or 4-2s or even 4-2s or 5-1s on the team that's not favored, right? And you got to get weird. You got to get different when you're playing Showdown to be successful. One thing that I think is really valuable about SaberSim overall, and let's take a look at maybe the Sunday night game, is that because we're leveraging real game simulations when we build these lineups, you don't actually have to worry about those rules of thumb too much, right? There's a lot of NFL Showdown content out there where people will go and analyze past slates or past games that those two teams played against each other, or past showdowns or other primetime slates where the spread was similar or the total were similar or both. And all it is it's a hunt to try to basically predict what the possible game outcomes could be. But with SaberSim, we've actually simulated out a ton of those game outcomes, almost all of those outcomes, play by play, thousands of times. And when you build lineups, you're actually going into that database of game simulations and building the lineups that are optimal for those game sims. So when sim variance is at 10, right, what is actually literally happening is we're taking an individual game sim of this game, then applying like an ownership multiplier to use some lower owned plays, but overall giving you the optimal lineup that came out of that individual game sim. So we'll build this and just see what this looks like real quickly. But it allows you to kind of select lineups with confidence, because you know you're not trying to come up with a game script yourself necessarily, nor are you trying to build the lineup to target a certain game script. You are actually looking, and you actually have lineups at your disposal that you know are from a certain game script, right? Because they're pulled directly from our game sims. And this game is a couple days away here. It's the Sunday night game. Projections might be a little out of whack, but the example kind of still stands here. And you can see we get a different variety of these different stack types here, right? But there's definitely some variety there. But I think this can be an insanely powerful tool because it's avoiding, there's a compounding assumptions here of trying to come up with the game scripts yourself and then also create the lineups that fit those game scripts that you just don't have to worry about here. I actually, honestly, when I'm playing Showdown, I am far more likely to remove balanced builds, force unbalanced builds, and then actually force balanced builds for the underdog, or force onslaught lineups for the underdog purely to get different. I am more likely to play lineups like these purely to get different than play balanced builds and lineups where the favorite has more players in it. Because again, and the reason I can do this is because I know there's a simulation backing up each of these, right? I'm not just having to kind of make these up or guess from my head, right? There's a game sim that supports every single lineup we see here. So very, very powerful. Neil said, how does SaberSim calculate ownership projections? How it works is we take an aggregate projection from a variety of sources around the industry. We build let's go to the main slate. We build a ton, 1,000+ lineups, probably more than that, a few thousand lineups at a very high variance setting. It depends on the sport, right? Sometimes we'll also have a little bit of correlation in there to make sure that the lineups kind of look stacked a little bit too, because people are likely to stack their lineups. But we build lineups at very high correlation settings, and the ownership projections that we have for the slate are the exposures we had to those players in that build. So I think it's a very strong ownership model, particularly because it comes from actually building individual lineups, right? A ownership model that doesn't at some level attempt to build actual lineups, I think, can miss combinations of players that fit well together because of correlations or because of salary requirements or things like that, right? But there are some limitations. First of all, it is a purely data-driven computer model, right? We do no manual adjustments to it apart from feeding it the inputs of that aggregate projection. So at times, this can be a little bit more thought of as what the field would do if the field was perfectly like rational. If the field was given, if everybody playing the contest was given the exact same projections, what would the field do if they were basically perfectly sharp? That's essentially what our ownership projections are, but that's not actually what is happening. So at lower stakes, where people aren't going to find the best plays as well, you may see lower ownership on some of the best projected plays overall. You may see higher ownership on plays that are almost inherently impossible to predict. We also won't pick up on narratives very well. If there's like a certain narrative that picks up a lot of steam, right? Revenge games, sometimes, especially at lower stakes, can kind of start to steam a certain player, or a chalky player that is getting steamed in content, right? Like Marquise Brown from last week ended up at like 35% owned. Nobody really predicted that. And I think a lot of the reason why that happened is because he was a very popular, talked about low owned play going into the weekend. That made him a high owned play when the slate actually started. So I think you can definitely add some value here. The biggest, I mentioned this a couple days ago. I don't know if you're talking about football or basketball, but one of the big things that I've been doing this year for basketball is looking at the top owned plays, and I think I can do a pretty good job of just kind of intuitively seeing who the guys are that I don't think are actually going to be that highly owned, just by sorting by the ownership projection. And a lot of times, trying to think of a good example, right? A lot of times there are these guys that are decently projected, low salary plays that I think, again, it's the builder probably thinks like, okay, here's a good example, is Derek Favors, right? I haven't studied the slate deeply tonight, but you can see that the builder is taking some projection where he is presumably projected at like 6 points per dollar, right? Works out as a pretty good per average play, and then thinks that 16% of the lineups aren't going to include Derek Favors. I think this is pretty unlikely. Again, I haven't studied the slate deeply, but I don't, this just feels off to me. These are kinds of some of the plays, I would say low salary, high point per dollar plays. When they're not spectacularly high point per dollar plays, the builder sometimes overrates, right? Like Tony Bradley is an 8x value. He's clearly going to be highly owned tonight. He's actually probably going to be a little bit higher owned than this. But when you have those guys that are like 3 to 4.5K that are projected for 5 to 6 points on the dollar, those are the plays that I do think we overrate a little bit on the ownership projections. So you can add value here for sure, but we have put a lot of work into it this season. And I think our projections for our ownership projections are about as good as they've ever been. So, all right, cool. I'm going to keep ripping through these questions here real quickly. And we'll keep it rolling. Cody said, would also be nice with positions. So you can set things like no more than one running back per team or no more than one D from the same team in hockey. Yeah, those are all kinds of the things that we are hoping to add here with more control in step 3 in the future. I think at times, depending on precisely what you are trying to do, you can kind of get away with it, especially for football. You can get away with it by using some of our advanced stacking rules creatively, but it's not ideal and not very intuitive. So we do want to add more control to those kinds of things in the future. So Jared says, if you have a core of players you're wanting to use in NBA, would you adjust those exposures in step 3 or in step 1? There's been a lot of back and forth on this recently. We've talked about this particular question a lot here in the past week, really. I think there's kind of a reason. There are reasons and advantages to do both. I would say I would start with doing it in step 3. The reason why it's nice to do it in step 3 is you're going to let SaberSim, you're going to remove all restrictions from SaberSim. You're going to let it take its simulations and projections and ownership and default sliders and build you a nice pool of 500 to 1,500 lineups that we think are optimal for the contest. And from there, you can go in and dial in your exposures and select your favorite 20 from that pool of 500, right? So as we're adjusting exposures here to certain players, maybe to manage risk, maybe to find leverage, whatever you're doing, right? We are resorting through this pool of 500 to give the best 20 that fit the requirements in the exposures. And what's nice about that is you're picking from a pool of lineups that we already think are viable, right? The system has kind of been untouched here. I think that's great. However, if you are if you have a lot of restrictions you are going to put on the builder, you're going to set a ton of different min and max exposures. I know some people out there have a min and max exposure window for every single player on the slate, right? They know beforehand, before they even start building lineups, that every player needs to land in some certain window of min and max exposure, right? If you did that on step 3, you would eventually see an error saying you need to build more lineups. The likelihood of being able to safely set a min and max exposure for every single player in your pool without exceeding 500 is pretty low. So if you're that kind of player, if you're finding that in step 3, you're seeing an error a lot to build more lineups, at that point, I think it makes more sense to set some of these min exposures or max exposures before you build so that we can build you a pool of lineups that is a lot more in line with what you're trying to do on the slate. I personally try to touch as little as possible before build from the standpoint of exposures and do as much of it as possible after the build. But there are different strokes, right? Depending on what you're trying to accomplish. So Dean says, what should the ownership fade tab set be at other than the default setting for NFL DFS Showdown? I've had trouble the last 3 Showdown slates with finding the right value play guy that goes off. Well, so the value, the default value for ownership fade for a single game Showdown slate, it has been back tested for your contest you're playing, right? So when you open this up and it says for maybe you're playing the big 20 max contests, right? And it's saying ownership fade at 3. That is a value that we have back tested by building lineups at every other combination of sliders and determining that this is the optimal setting. Now, I think there is okay, let me say this. I think one thing that's nice about this is that, especially at the very low projected plays, this will push you in a direction of getting some exposure to guys that are really going to be pretty spectacularly low owned. Like on Showdowns, on NFL Showdowns, there's often a guy or a couple guys that end up being chalky because they just have a strangely, okay, so like Zay Jones could be that guy. Let's actually just see. Yeah, so okay, so like Josh Gordon or Zay Jones in particular really stands out. It's like that guy that is under 1K, very low on play, that projects for like 2 points, 1 point, a few points more than the other guys at his salary range, but has essentially the exact same ceiling. Like that player is still essentially like it's basically a prayer that guy gets in the end zone or somehow gets the 100-yard bonus or something like that, right? Like all the guys at low salary have very similar expectations. That ownership fade slider will help lead you to the play that is a little bit lower owned there, the leverage play, so to speak. But I do think there is a strong argument to be made of turning this to 0. And I think a lot of people, I've seen a lot of users do this. A lot of sharp players do this. What you get out of this is you basically remove ownership from the equation and you tell SaberSim, just give me the best 500 optimals. Give me basically the 500 optimals most likely to occur in our base of slate simulations. And then from there, you can make your own leverage plays or select the individual lineups you want to roll with. This, when ownership fade is on, we're going to take 500. We're going to take 500 individual game sims of the game, but then apply an ownership multiplier to emphasize lower owned plays, which is a good thing. But if you don't want that at all, I think you can justify turning ownership fade off and just take the optimals themselves. Just being aware that this is going to build you lineups that are a little bit more duplicated, a little bit higher chance to be duplicated. So overall, I would probably leave it where it is for the average player. But I would say if you're going to go through, like Max has been on stream here before talking about how he goes through his lineup pool in step 3 and individually looks for combinations of players that are going to be not often used together, right? It's almost as if you take all of the rules of thumb that people tell you about how to build these good Showdown lineups and then intentionally go look for those combinations of players just to get different, right? Like, let's go find our Derek Carr captain lineups and go find lineups in our pool where we have the Chiefs, because nobody's going to do that, right? So you add it. Just because it's uncommon, right? Like if you're going to do stuff like this in step 3, I think it makes a little bit more sense to turn the ownership fade slider off. But okay, cool. I'm going to keep ripping through these questions here today, guys. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to stay too long over on today's show, but I'm going to keep going and keep answering the rest of these questions here. So Jared says, when a new player comes to a team, how long does it take to get correlation dialed in on that player? Well, again, there's kind of two answers to this. So the first is that because we are simulating out games, right, we can recalculate how that player is correlated to other players on their lineup relatively quickly, right? As quickly as the game sims can run. And that can be a really good advantage. The caveat to that is that it is difficult to know exactly how that player is going to be employed by that new team, or how that player is going to be used, or how they fit into the scheme. And no model is necessarily going to know that well. So it's a double-edged sword, really. You know, I don't know. OBJ, I guess, right? That's the big news, right? So we'll be able to simulate games with OBJ playing on the Rams very quickly and have an understanding of how correlated he is to Matt Stafford. I almost said Sam Bradford. The name popped into my head. That's blast from the past. No, Matt Stafford. We'll understand how correlated he is and how he fits in and where it makes sense to stack him as soon as he plays is for the first game he's playing with the Rams. But nobody knows exactly how that player is going to be employed. So those are the situations, the best situations where you can spend a little time adding value by tweaking projections or ownership or things like that, are always those situations where there's new information, a new situation that no model is going to be able to deal with super well. So I see Jared kind of corrected some of the language here on this question. Hopefully I think I still answered that the right way. So Pop said, playing NBA tonight, single bullet in the $88. How would you run that? Single entry 20 max or 150. It has MME 58. I would pick some sliders in between the 20 max and the 150. Personally, I would recommend spreading that out. I think better for long-term realization of your expected value to spread out that $88 and get some more lineups going. But if you're gonna shoot a single bullet in, I assume is that maybe FanDuel? I would set your sliders to GPP. I don't know how many people are in it. I assume it's between 10 and 50K, and then look. So 20 max is 424, 150 max is 337. So I would probably pick something just in the middle, right? Oh, this is NBA. So something in the middle, right? Don't need to sweat it too much, but oh, Pop said DK. Yeah, I mean, same deal. The sliders won't change too much. So same deal, should be. So 20 max, 3-3. I guess maybe it is a little different. 3-3-5 on DK versus 3-3-7. So slightly different there between the two sites. So that actually simplifies it for DK. I would probably just roll it with 3-3-6. Let's see. Trenton said, would there be more positive EV in just avoiding ownership fade in general? The constant of the variance and projection should be strong enough to long-term turn long-term ROI. No, in basketball in particular, for like Showdown, I assume, maybe not. I mean, okay, so I'll answer this for both. For Showdown, like the biggest advantage that you're going to get out of having ownership fade on is you're going to lower your chance of being duplicated, even if you're sacrificing, right? Like even if we're sacrificing some raw projection or absolute top end upside here, you have a ton of your expected value in Showdown wrapped up in not getting duplicated, and you're going to add a lot of value by avoiding some duplication. So if you turn ownership fade off, I do think you should have some intentional goal of avoiding dupes in the step 3 process, but leaving it on will help avoid duplication overall. For main slates, right, ownership fade is still important, less so because it avoids duplication, but more so because it gives us relative edge on the field, right? A player scoring 50 raw points at 30% ownership is a lot different than a player scoring 50 raw points at 1% ownership. So while in basketball, lower variance sport where average projections are very predictive of results, I think it's by far the most important sport to build lineups that are just purely optimized for projection. Ownership is still very important. And if you have two players with the exact same range of outcomes at the exact same position and the exact same salary, you certainly want to play the lower owned player. And the ownership fade slider is going to help you make those decisions really quickly. So Pop said, one more question. If I have my 6 top stacks in NFL, is it better to lock them in on the stack builder, X out the other teams, and keep the teams I want, then run the sim? Is it better to lock them in on the stack builder, X out the other teams? I would say, okay. I would say the first thing I would do is run just a test build here, just like totally blank. Don't put anything in and just see what you're getting, right? Again, always very helpful just to see what SaberSim would recommend and how much you're getting of these teams. From there, I don't think it really matters. I think you have 2 options. You could go through and set a build here, either at basic or advanced, and say, give me 3 players from the same team, remove the defense, and I only want, you could even remove them all, and I only want, maybe these are your teams, right? I only want these teams. That's a perfectly fine way to do it. I think alternatively, you could set the stack rule and leave all teams in here included and just curate your quarterback player pool. So you could go through and pick the same guys. I don't remember exactly who was on that list. I think it was like this. And I think it was Rodgers. I think those will have ultimately the same impact. But I would recommend starting with a blank build, test build, just to see what you're getting. It can be helpful to see maybe if you're not thinking about a certain stack or a team that actually has some upside. So, maybe some Wentz lineups, 28-point total in our sims right now. Some Wentz lineups pop up, and maybe you start to include those in there too. So. But anyway, thanks everybody for tuning in today. I do have to hop off now here. Hopefully got solid answers to everybody's questions. Had a lot of questions coming in live today, which is always awesome. Always the best streams when we get a lot of engagement in chat. So appreciate you guys all being here. Of course, to everybody that watches or listens to this stream after as a recording on YouTube, appreciate you as well. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the Friday night NHL or NBA main slates tonight, and of course football this weekend. I will see you guys all again here on Monday, right back at it with office hours, 2 p.m. Eastern on Monday. We will answer your questions, any questions you've had from over the weekend, but also, of course, announce our winners and giveaway winners for this week's weekly Max Challenge. So thanks again. In the meantime, best of luck. See ya.